Dear guests and distinguished participants, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on Digitalizing Justice Systems, Mastering Change Management. My name is David Makarchan. I'm the e-Justice Development Manager with Synergy International Systems. And as you guessed, we have a lot of things to cover today. After our last webinar on how to effectively prepare stakeholder and technical requirements, map internal processes, and come up with a comprehensive RFP, which you can access on YouTube, we have received numerous suggestions and requests for webinar topics, and one that stood out from them is change management. Many of you acknowledge the relevance of this exercise, and as our speakers of the last webinar mentioned, the earlier you start, the better you will see the gaps to be filled in your institution when it comes to bringing change and innovation, especially technological change. Today, again, we have a diverse group of people with us from all over the world that we are excited about. And to be able to address all aspects of change management as part of a broader project implementation activity chain, we have asked one of our dearest clients representatives to join us in this webinar. We are delighted to have Dr. Katsande from Zimbabwe Judiciary here with us. Dr. Katsande is the head of Judicial Training Institute of Zimbabwe since 2021. She is also the deputy chairperson of the Integrated Electronic Case Management System, IECMS, Change Management Committee. As the deputy chairperson of the IECMS Change Management Committee, she heads the training and coaching thematic working area. In short, we couldn't have a better guest speaker for our webinar today. Welcome, Dr. Katsande. And as usual, we have Mrs. Naisen Karunji, e-justice expert at Synergy International Systems and head of Synergy Rwanda, and Mr. Khachatur Matevosyan, vice president of e-justice, Synergy International Systems. Quick notice before we start, all participants except for speakers will be muted during the webinar, but we encourage you to submit your questions via the chat. We will dedicate 15 minutes to Q&A at the end of this session. And in case you must leave before the end of the webinar, remember that we will post the webinar on YouTube and send it to all of you in the coming week or two. Now let's move to the topic of the webinar, change management. We can define change management as the application of structured processes and tools to lead the people side of change to achieve the expected goal. This webinar is going to cover three aspects corresponding to the activity timelines of change management process: preparation, change management activities before; implementation, activities during; and sustainability, activities after the change occurs. We will explore what we should do before we start implementation or piloting of the system. Then once the development is completed, what specifics of the change should we consider during this period? And then when your implementation is over technically, in other words, when your information system, let's say your case management system, is launched or piloted, where do you stand at this stage? So 3 timelines: before the change, during the change, and after the change. We're going to try and be as specific as possible and bring you actual examples and real-life situations that we encountered in our digitalization journeys with various justice sector institutions, and hope this will help you in your endeavors. I'll start with Khachatur. In your experience, Khachatur, what change management related challenges should we anticipate addressing for a smooth project adoption?
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone to the webinar. So whenever we start a project, different challenges can be faced, but what is common, it's a group of different aspects which should be really considered. So first of all, those are the capacity constraints. So whenever you start a project, you should clearly have defined in your mind who are the stakeholders and what capacity constraints they may have. So it's very important to consider that if it's an IT project that you start for digitization of, for example, judicial services, who are the stakeholders that will be using the system, and if you have all the capacity constraint addressed. For example, if you have a capacitated technical team who can support the system, if your users are computer literate or not, so having a clear understanding and plan on your stakeholders and their capacities and further plan is good. The second one, if you are making a change and it's is in regards to the implementation of a case management system specifically, it's very, very important from the beginning to have in mind to have a corresponding training plan for administrators, support team, and end users and trainers, and to make sure that from technical perspective, you will have the training environment always up and running, where you can do ongoingly the trainings and the well-adapted training materials. The third key concept that comes as a challenge is the resistance to change. Usually when we speak about any digital initiative in the justice sector institutions, people are used to working with papers. So when the change comes and they need to also work digitally, there is always a very big resistance to such change. So having a clear plan how you confront the institutional resistance to change is very important. Then, as we said, it's very important to have clearly defined stakeholders. So who will be your system users? In justice sector solutions, if your system is about, let's say, courts, meaning the public, which are the litigants and the lawyers, are also one of those users. So it's also very important not to concentrate only on internal communication about the change coming, but to have in mind clearly the public awareness promotional campaigns, which usually start even before the real go live. Then another concept, which is also important, is how people are going to use it. So making sure that you guarantee access to e-justice whenever you initiate such kind of a change. Meaning if in some countries there is not enough infrastructure and people cannot use services if the court is digital, so there should be a clear plan on how actually the access to justice is organized. So our panelists will speak more detailed about this one. And then it's about the scale. In some countries, they start these initiatives from a very small scale. They can take one court or only one court level or only the high prosecution national level offices to kick. But it's very important to consider how you are going to adapt to the scale and what is your end goal. So if you are doing a nationwide case management system, for example, covering all levels of courts, it's important to have in mind the adaptation to the scale. And the last, but not less important, is having a clear plan on adopting the procedural laws. Because whenever you start a change on digitalizing in justice sector, many aspects of the work are actually fixed in different, it can be laws, it can be court rules or ministerial orders. But when the processes are becoming digital, many aspects need to be covered also in the law. So it's also important when making such kind of change to have clearly in mind the procedural laws which needs to be changed, and to have a working group which will review all current laws and make sure that coming system doesn't contradict anyhow, or if need be, to initiate some changes in laws or court rules or any other legal procedures. David?
Now I want to invite Dr. Katsande to help with the following question. When the decision was made to implement and later deploy the IECMS Zimbabwe, what were your thoughts on change management before implementation and even before deployment? Did you anticipate the challenges highlighted by Hachatur? Did you have anything already in place, or were you taking steps in this direction?
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, interesting questions you're raising, David. You notice that for us here in Zimbabwe, we introduced IECMS in 2022. But the first thing that we had to do before introducing IECMS was to benchmark with countries that had already introduced IECMS. So by the time we launched IECMS, we had a change management committee that had been put in place, and this committee is made up of members of a senior grade and they report to the Secretary of the Judicial Service Commission. And the committee had five thematic areas. One that focuses on communication, one that focuses on, the other one focuses on stakeholder interactions, and the other one is on technical support and budgeting. And then you find that focus really was on five things that we'll speak about. The first one is communication. It is very important that we communicate the reason for change to all stakeholders. We notice that when it comes to stakeholders, we have your internal stakeholders who are the users of the system, internal, and then the external stakeholders outside the Judicial Service Commission itself. So everyone has to come on board and understand why we are moving from paperful courts to paperless courts. And we also needed to assess the impact of change on both the internal and external stakeholders. Kacheto talked about resistance earlier on. If people are not aware as to why they're supposed to be doing what they are doing, some of them are bound to resist. So we needed to assess this impact. And having done that, develop a plan to support these internal stakeholders. Internal stakeholders, we're talking about our judges, we're talking about magistrates, we're talking of the registrars, those who use the system on a day-to-day basis. Develop a plan that support the internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders through the change process. The resistance that we talked about earlier on, it is not because that people don't want the change, but much of it is not knowing what exactly the change is bringing to them. So training also became training is very important. Providing training and support that ensure successful adoption of the change. Everybody needs to be trained on how to use the system. And having trained, you need to monitor the progress and make adjustments when needed. No system is perfect from the word-go, right? Once you deploy, you start using the system, you can then realize, because the anticipation is that the system should mirror the physical. The digital system should mirror the physical, what you've been doing whilst before deployment of the system. So monitoring progress is very important, and then adjust as and when there's need to do so.
I want to ask Nysen about her experience of introducing the change in justice sector institutions in the initial stages of the project. Nysen, I know that you were part of the implementations of both IECMS Rwanda, IECMS Zimbabwe, ECCMIS Uganda. What points would you highlight in this space?
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to schedule my responses into two parts. First, I'm going to talk about the activities before implementation, and then the activities before deployment. When we talk about activities before implementation, I would like to call these as the foundations of our change that is to come. And here I want to stress that you truly need to understand your reality before development. As we said in our last webinar, the earlier you start, the better. So the first activity that I would recommend is to create a focus group, a needs assessment focus group. This focus group should ideally comprise of representatives from the different stakeholders. For example, if you're introducing a case management system to court, you should form this focus group that should consist of a judge or two, a registrar, a lawyer, a prosecutor, for example. If you want an integrated system, etc., everyone should be represented. The reason is this: people understand best what they do. So when you create such a focus group, they are more likely to explain or to bring forth what would help them in this change. Because, as Dr. Katsande said, people resist the change because they don't know what it is and they don't know what is in it for them. How is it helping them? But if they're involved from the beginning, then you can be sure that this change answers to their needs. Now, having formed this group, I would recommend reviewing the laws and regulations in place and trying to find loopholes or areas of improvement, so that when the system comes, it is already has a foundation in the law, and it is not just a replication of the law, because in most of our jurisdictions, our laws are outdated, to be honest. So we want to make sure that we be innovative and make sure that we create improvements as we anticipate the system, because it should come better than what we have been using in the last years, for example. So please make sure that you review your laws. Thirdly, I would say review your infrastructure, because if the change comes and people do not have the equipment to use it, they're definitely going to reject it because they cannot find themselves in it. Also, if you have a technology in place, or if it is, for example, an e-filing system or any other technology, review it as well. Find some loopholes, find areas of improvements, so that when the implementation starts, all these changes can be captured. Lastly, before implementation, I would say do your proper stakeholder analysis. How ready are they for the change? What impact do they have on the change? What technical capacity do they have? Because I want to iterate what Dr. Katsande said, if they don't know it, they will reject it. They don't know how to use it. If they don't have the technical skills, they simply will reject it, and they will actively resist it, in fact. On my second section of the answer, which is in regards to before deployment, so now we have developed a system and we're going to deploy it. I think this would be the best time to create a change management plan and implement the change management plan, which will consist of activities related to trainings, activities related to stakeholder management, activities related to public awareness and resistance to change, etc. So make sure that during this time before deployment, you give yourself ample time to carry out the change management activities to make sure that your stakeholders are ready and equipped for the change. Secondly, I would say, in my experience working with the Rwanda IECMS, this was the best time for us to create specialized videos that would help people, kind of like a user manuals, but videos for them to follow and be able to train themselves where there is not enough people to train. As Hashatu was saying, scaling up the system can be really hard, especially if you need to deal with the public. So when you have such customized videos, especially in your local language that people would quickly understand and jump onto, it can really be good and ease your strain on support. This would also be a good time to do change management workshops and also review the lessons learned in your previous activities to adapt to the next activities. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Nyson. Khachatur, I want to bring this conversation back to you and ask about the role of the vendor or supplier in this process. You have been part of many projects and oversaw their start to finish journey. What contributions can or should the client expect from the vendor? Maybe share some examples of Synergy's contributions to the client's projects.
Thank you, David. Actually, the role of the vendor is really big in the scope of the project, and it's very important that vendor delivers what it has committed. But if we take vendors, let's say, contribution from perspective of helping to manage the change, there are three key points which I would like to highlight. First of all, as our panelists told, it's very important to facilitate the transition to the change. And what the vendor can do to make this success is the ongoing support and cooperation during the whole journey. And one thing which the vendor should have in mind, and we always try to keep it, is that from the beginning, not everyone have extensive experience of implementation of IT projects in governments. So some aspects can be skipped, some aspects can be missed, but when you even not only do the trainings or testing, but you also draft your change management plan or you review more thoroughly your laws, there can come some change requests or some modifications. Will it be inside the scope or will it be inside the schedule? So when the vendor is supportive and collaborative, these changes are done easily. So they help the committees or the contract owners to facilitate the transition. Then second one, again, which happened a lot. Sometimes the end stakeholders and users, they try to find justifications why not to use the system, because there is always high resistance. And one thing which is very, which the vendor, and we always try to fight against, is to make sure that system is always available and reliable. Because in the beginning, when they start using, once the system goes down, everybody can say, the system is not working. We cannot use it, we were telling. So there is always pre-resistance. So making sure to have an advanced monitoring and support and system always up and running is one thing which helps the client-side change management team to do their, to promote the change on their side. And the third and very important component is always to give a lot of attention to the trainings. And it's not only trainings of trainers, which are very important so that they can train all the end users, but it's also very, very important to have the technical teams also trained for the support. Because it's one thing when people know how to use the system, but it's also very important that there is local capacity that will be able to support if there are any issues. And one thing that we heard in many countries, the end users saying was, can we maintain the system ourselves, or we need every time to touch with the vendor who is overseas or somewhere else? So when the vendor helps and delivers the technical trainings and capacitates the client on not just support, but also maintaining the system, that also helps in confronting the resistance and facilitating the transition to the electronic systems. David?
Thank you, Khachatur. Now we will be moving to the second part of our change timeline. What happens during the deployment of the change? How should we approach our change management activities to keep the changing mindset going without disrupting the services rendered to citizens? Let's start with Nysen. What would your approach be here, Nysen?
Thank you, David, for this opportunity again. My approach here would be to anticipate and be realistic. Anticipate why? We should always anticipate that there will be resistance. It doesn't matter what the change is, there will always be resistance. So during the time of deployment, we should always anticipate what the stakeholders' next move could be, always trying and anticipating and helping them to not reach a point of going back to their previous way of working. So always and always you have to be realistic again. My second point, if, for example, the court does not have internet, in my previous response, I said that before implementation, you need to make sure that there is infrastructure, internet, computers, etc. But imagine it comes to time for deployment and you know for sure that this court does not have internet, or it doesn't have, people don't have computers, they're sharing just one computer. It is realistically not okay to deploy a case management system in such a court. Rather, it would be good to first make sure that people have the equipment they need and then deploy the system after. So please always be realistic when introducing a change. The next point I would share is to intensify change activities at least 2 weeks before deployment and 2 weeks after deployment, because this is the time where reality kicks in and people are like, okay, the system is here, the change is here. We are not ready. They're never ready. What should we do to catch on? So this would be the best time to intensify trainings, intensify public awareness, intensify all the activities that you have already designed in your change management plan. The third point I would say is to try as much as possible to use the resources you have to achieve the desired outcome. Why do I say this? I know that in most countries, they have limited resources. Most countries, most institutions have limited resources. So if you can use the available resources to make sure that people use the change, it would be good. And I will give an example. In Rwanda, when the ICMS was introduced, people already knew how to use emails. They had emails. So the change management team saw it as an opportunity to create a mailing group for the stakeholders to share and brainstorm their ideas, while as well solving the issues that they may encounter in the use of ICMS. So if a registrar up-country faces an issue, instead of calling the IT person all the time, they write in the mailing group, and another registrar in the capital that faced that issue, for example, could respond. Another example I would take is from Uganda. When they introduced the ECCMIS, they used what they call the ECCMIS hour, which was really integrated in the normal way of the working of the stakeholders, that they would take an hour off their work to talk about ICMS and iron out any issues that they may have. And I also could go on, but I have another one example from Zimbabwe. I'm happy that Dr. Katsande is here, but Zimbabwe's approach to public awareness was really striking for me, because they opted to brand buses to go through the town. So all the public, everyone who sees this bus knows that there is an activity in the justice sector about ICMS, and they want to find out more information about ICMS. Lastly, lastly, I would say that make sure you have a checklist so that nothing skips your mind. You have a checklist and tick off to make sure that everything is in place. Infrastructure is in place? Are there channels of support already in place, especially when it comes to access to justice for the public? Are all the strategies we have laid completed? Have people been trained? Do they know the benefits of ICMS? Please make sure you have a checklist during this time of deployment. And finally, I cannot stress this enough. Laws and regulations are what guide the justice sector. If something is not in the laws and regulations, it will be contested by lawyers, it will be contested by everyone, and it will create more havoc and increase resistance to change. So please make sure that the laws that need to be enacted are enacted, the ones that need to change have changed. And if the processes of your adoption of the law is too long, I will go back to my anticipate. If it is too long, please try to find a way to make the introduction of the change as legal as can be. If you have to use a Chief Justice directives, for example, or any other ministerial directives, please make sure that the laws do not block the use of the ICMS. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Nyson. Very useful advice for those who are in the middle of their change management process and are looking for tips. Now I want to go back to Zimbabwe ICMS again and its lessons learned, and see some of the practical steps regarding the change management and its deployment stage that were made during the implementation. Dr. Katsande, what would you add here?
Thank you. Thank you, David. I entirely agree with the previous speakers. And for us here in Zimbabwe, in terms of lessons learned, I think one thing that was very clear to us was that commitment of all stakeholders is key when implementing a new system. You need everyone on board, and you need to be reading from the same page. We also learned we can not I cannot overemphasize the issue of training. Continuous training is key. It keeps users of the system up to date with the changes in the system, and it also helps to identify any gaps that may be there. So as you training the users of the system. You also note that maybe we need to improve this in the system, maybe we need to do that. Because, like I said earlier, no system is perfect from the word go. And then Kachatua talked earlier about amendment of rules. Nyson has also emphasized on that, and that's one thing that we also learned, the famous amendment of rules. And alignment with the new system is crucial. As you anticipate launching the system, you need to go back to your rules, you need to go back to the laws. To what extent do the rules, do the laws support the new system? And also there's need to prioritize public awareness campaigns to market the system and gather support of the public. Nelson gave a good example of what we did here in Zimbabwe, branding of buses, and also I have what we would call IECMS Fridays, where every Friday we'll give time to talk IECMS at all our court stations. We go into those streets, we distribute flyers, because it's important that our external stakeholders also understand what is happening. And then we also learned that it's, you need to address challenges as you go. The number of challenges that you encounter is as you introduce a new system. These you can only address as you go. Some you anticipate them, some they emerge. Some challenges emerge, you may not have anticipated them. So address all challenges as you go. And then finally, indigent litigants. You need to have systems that support indigent litigants. There are the litigants who may not have access, because our ECMS is web-based. It requires certain gadgets, a computer, a smartphone, a tablet, and most importantly, it requires access to the internet. So you need to support. And in Zimbabwe, to set up e-filing centers at each and every court stations, and even went up as far as coming up with internet hubs, so that for those who are not able to access the system, who do not have the resources to do that, they have access. And there are e-filing officers at every e-filing centers who help those who are not very familiar with the system and who help the indigents. David, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katsande. We are slowly approaching the final part of our webinar, and this is the time when I normally remind our participants to send us their questions in the chat. So I suggest you send some questions you are facing right now. Let's say you are in the middle of your preparation stage, or in your implementation, or preparing for deployment. What are the things you are struggling with, or what are the things you must choose between? I'm sure our experts here can help you with that. And in the meantime, let's get back to our session and talk about the third stage, where we have introduced our change, but shouldn't we be aware of its sustainability to avoid the risk of stakeholders going back to their old way of working? Nyson, I've always wondered, are there any distinct exercises or tactics that you leave for this stage of the change management? Anything that will be applicable to this part and benefits the client the best?
Thanks again, David. When we talk about sustainability, we are essentially talking about retaining the people that are already using the system, and also bringing the new people that are going to use the system up to speed. So some of the activities I would recommend at this stage is definitely support, to make sure that there is enough support for people that are already using the system, and also the ones that will come in future, and to make sure that this support is easily accessible, whether it can be through emails, through social media, or even through call centers. Again, please use the resources you have first, and you can tap into that and make sure that people are supported as much as possible. Number two is to make sure that you collect feedback, analyze it, and integrate it. because when stakeholders ask, they'll give you feedback. Most times it's the negative feedback, but it is really what you need to improve. So make sure that you do not underestimate feedback when you receive it, analyze it, and if there's need for integration of those recommendations, please do not be rigid to change. Please make sure you're change implementers, and please do not be rigid to change. So please make sure that you capture any kind of recommendations from the feedback. Number 3 is, at this stage, you should have a way of monitoring your change, monitoring its progress, adjusting if needed. Is it reaching the target that we wanted to? Are people using it the right way? I remember when we implemented the IECMS in Rwanda, we always had the court leaders meetings, and in those meetings we'd go through the system and see who is using the system, how are they using it, what challenges are people facing considering the data that we have in the system. If, for example, judges are hearing cases and they're not updating the system, we would go through the system and monitor and see how people are using the system, and then make sure that we communicate that, and we adjust as needed. And this brings me to enforcing the change through recognition and rewards. So during these meetings, these court leaders meetings, or during the internal court meetings, it would be a best time to recognize the people that are performing well in this change, to give them some rewards. They don't have to be big rewards, but for them to feel that they're recognized. And this creates a kind of positive competition, because everyone is like, I don't want to be left behind. In the next meeting, I'll be the one to get this reward. So please make sure that the culture of recognition and reward is truly embedded at this stage. Next, I want to talk about continuous trainings. I said sustainability is about maintaining the people we have and also adopting the new ones. Trust me, by the time people use the system, 2, 3, or even 6 months, there will be updates in the system, because you'll see what you need to improve there. People need to be trained about this. When new staff come in, you need to make sure that you have a schedule for when they will be hired, when they will be trained on the system before they start their jobs. So training is truly continuous, and Hashatul talked about having a training environment. This would come in handy at this stage. You also need to make sure, my last point is that you keep reviewing your laws. Change does not stop when the change is implemented. Actually, it's almost the beginning, because this allows you to innovate more, to change more. Before COVID-19, most of the case management systems had not anticipated having a virtual court, for example. Now there is need for a virtual court. During COVID-19, there was need for a virtual court. So we cannot just sit and let these opportunities pass us by, as today we are talking about AI, for example. So the more we innovate in terms of technology, the more we need to review and update our laws and regulations, as well as processes as well. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Nyson. Now I want to engage Dr. Katsande. Dr. Katsande, you successfully piloted the IECMS Zimbabwe in May 2022. What would you say were the lessons learned or the key success factors for your system adoption?
Thank you, David. Yes, firstly, I think you talked about the issue of resistance, and it keeps on coming. Yes, we need to address resistance, and this mainly is by explaining how the change will impact different stakeholders, right? We're introducing a new system, how are different stakeholders impacted? And secondly, it's very important that once you launch the system on deployment, you need to ask for feedback. Feedback is important. It will provide you with ways to improve future changes in the system. Go back to the users of the system and elicit their feedback. Establishment of change leaders is one other thing that we noticed that works, because without buy-in from the users of the system, your initiative is over before it even begins. It's very important. Identify change leaders as here in Zimbabwe say, who spread the IECMS gospel. Let people understand, especially the benefits that the system begins. And one thing that we also learned is when rolling out, the issue of rolling out in phases. As in Zimbabwe, we're rolling out in 4 phases. We've successfully completed the first 3 phases, and we're now moving on to the last phase. And that gave us the opportunity to be able to look back. You know, when you start with one phase, you perfect it, you move on to the next phase, you perfect it until you get to the last phase. And then we've been talking about training throughout this webinar. But I think what is important as far as training is concerned is that you need to use different variety, right? Use different methods of training, because not everybody learns in the same way. I think Nelson talked earlier on about instructional videos, about, you know, just be innovative enough, come up with different methods of training that caters for the different stakeholders that you'll be working with. Thank you, David.
Khatchatur, improved access to justice is crucial in justice systems. What would you say are the best change management practices, especially in maintaining access to justice while introducing a new change, such as a case management system in the courts?
When we usually start these type of initiatives, one of the questions that we have always been asked is how we imagine the system to work, and how we imagine an old aged person using computer to file her claim to the court. So there are multiple solutions to this, but I will try to say which is very important from the beginning is, first of all, to keep always in mind when before starting the project, when you have to draft actually the change management and the requirements, is to keep in mind that this is a change for the public, and this is system. It should be reviewed also from the client perspective. For example, how to make it in a way to make the litigants' access, for example, to the system more seamless, and what brings them to the court most. Because you need to be able to answer the question why this change is being done. What not only changes in the way they do the work, but what will be more helpful for them. It's very important to get the advantages well in the system and then to promote it. And when you have such system, what will be required in it to make sure that it will eliminate some of the unnecessary processes. As one of the example that we had in Zimbabwe, before the system, summoning was physical. So if somebody had to be notified, they had to take the printed summon to that person or a notice. But when the system came, it had requirements to have electronic sending of notifications, and also mechanisms to validate that this notification has been sent and has been delivered to the person. So with the changes in the procedural laws and with the implementation of such functionalities, some of the aspects were facilitated. So it's very important to reduce the burden that will help to the change to be adopted. Then second one, as our panelists and Dr. Katsande also told, is about how to create an environment for physical access to the infrastructure. Because what we saw that works very well, and especially in the rural areas, and when we speak about access to justice, we don't only concentrate on the capital, where the infrastructure is grosso modo much better. We also concentrate on rural areas where people also have to have access to justice. So a training plan for cyber cafes which are around, or having groups of facilitators, young, more IT favorable persons who can help. and also working with bar associations on training of lawyers. So meaning having not only the court staff or specific people, but also a wider range of facilitators and points where people can use to access it. Then public awareness. We always speak about this, I think, in every part of the webinar, but it's very, very important. Meaning starting from any announcements weeks before the system is launched, intensifying and after. And this can be using the radios, newspaper. In some countries, Twitter is always working well, or any other social media. If there is possibility or budget, even having some advertisement through the TV channels and during different judicial events, speaking about this helps it. And of course, having the trainings and user materials in a way that people are used to. So having not just video materials, but also some prefer, because you need to understand that whenever you bring such change at national level, some will be favorable for video materials on trainings. Some try to click and see how it works, but for others, some small written guides are always the best. So having all this ready and prepared and accessible to the public. And then to make it sustainable, it's very important to have a clear end user support channels, because it's not only in-system support. Some people always are used to calling some hotline numbers or having solutions which facilitate connecting and support of those systems. So having not only support from vendor, but also local support team, and for institution users and for public is also very key to make it sustainable. David?
Thank you, Khachatur. Now we approach the part of our webinar where we take questions from our participants and distribute them to the speakers. I don't see any questions in the chat, and in the meantime, I guess maybe our participants are thinking about questions and they will write them soon. I have a question from one of the registered people to our webinar who couldn't make it to the actual webinar, but I want to raise this question on their behalf and ask to our speakers. The question is the following: how to make sure judges will use the system, or the registrars will use the system after introducing one in the courts, presumably. What, in your experience, helped in this regard? I presume the person is from the judiciary, from the courts. So let me direct this question to Khachatur, and then we will go to Nysen and Dr. Katsande, and let's see what they say about this very unique situation. Khachatur?
Thank you, David. And it's actually a very interesting question. And there are multiple ways how to facilitate that people want to use the system. And one thing that we noticed that works well is to have clearly defined set of functionalities, which clearly shows to the stakeholders what is how the system is facilitating their daily work. I can bring an example that everybody a lot of people were telling us that if you go to so-called, for example, hybrid solution, where you do everything on paper and then you need to scan it and upload into the system and fill some additional information there, it is double work. So a clear way of showing to each stakeholder how their daily working process changes and how system helps them to perform better, to achieve better results in their daily work by spending less effort and by using technology, that helps to the adoption. Because if you tell people that they need to do a lot of extra things, but not get anything in return, that creates huge resistance. And the change itself is a resistance. So from functionalities and features perspective, first of all, system should be designed in that way that to clearly show to people that whatever they were doing before on paper, with this change, they can do faster, easier, and with better results. And to have to have more easier way and more structured manner of working to increase their performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Khachatur. Nyson?
Thank you, David. Making sure that judges use the system is a really interesting one. First of all, judges want to make sure that the law is completely and utterly implemented. So the first question they're going to ask is it provided for in the law? Well, which article? And so if for some reason this change or this system is not, even one functionality, if it is not provided for in the law, then they do not understand why they need to use it. Second of all is about trainings. You don't just train judges in any way that you feel like. In my experience, I have noted that judges actually like to be trained by their fellow judges, which is why one of the change management activities is to make sure that you get early buy-ins from the stakeholders. So you need to make sure that you have at least a judge on your team that is going to help train other judges. I learned this the hard way because I used to train judges when we introduced the IECMS Rwanda. And every time I would enter the training hall, I would tell them about the technology, the functionalities, how good it is. It moves the case from this stage to this stage. And then they'll start quoting for me articles of the law and asking, but in this law, this issue or this point is supposed to be treated in this way. How do we deal with that? And it is the first time I'm hearing this article of the law. So, but if it is a judge in my place, then he speaks their language. So actually the initiative we took in Rwanda was to make sure that for each training hall, we have at least an IT person to deal with the technical questions. We have a judge to train the judges. And if it is a training for the registrars, then we have a registrar to do that. I think it was effective. Regarding the trainings, again, I would advise not to have all stakeholders crumpled in one room. Make sure that judges are alone, they are trained alone, they can address what they work in, they can exchange ideas, they can talk about their issues, and make sure that registrars are also given their own space, their own training, and their own room. It could be simultaneously, but try not to crump them in the same room. Finally, I will share this story. Judges understand impact. So they need to understand what is the impact of their actions when using the system. I'll give an example. When we introduced IECMS in Rwanda, it is fully integrated. And when a person is arrested and the judge makes a decision, automatically this person's sentence is calculated. And when they will be released is also calculated automatically. So some of the judges, because they did not fully grasp what their actions implied to the system and to the whole justice chain, for them, they understand that if they judge a case, their responsibility is to render a copy of judgment. And the copy of judgment should be implemented as is. So we used to have a number of judges that were not actually filling their sentence in the system. And so we had to personalize our trainings and go to them individually and be like, so why do you not fill these things in the system? They're really important. And they say, why are they important? They have a copy of judgment. They can always take the copy of judgment and this person would be released. So we had to personalize our training and show them in the system and teach them how a copy of judgment is not enough to make sure that this person, if he's in jail or if he needs to complete his sentence, for the system to calculate this sentence, the judge needs to fill it in the system. And once these judges understood that the actions they're not doing in the system have actual impact, they took on the system and even they became the trainers of other judges as well. So it is very, very important to make sure that judges understand the impact of their actions in a technical world. Otherwise, they just think it is an IT system. It has nothing to do with me. My work is just to deliver a copy of judgment. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Nyson. Dr. Katsande, I want to now come back to you, but I also want to add two more questions to the one raised initially from the chat, because participants from Eritrea Judiciary are particularly interested in Zimbabwe experience. So the question is the following: can you share with us the challenges and process during the phases of Zimbabwe experience? Namely, how was the implementation introduced if there was a paper-based system previously? And what indicators do you use in your system as performance indicators for your court system? So I know it maybe require a very long response, but feel free to keep it as short as you like, please.
Thank you, David. I'll answer the first one first on how to make judges use the system. For us, Zimbabwe, that option was not there, because we did once we deployed the system, like we deployed the system first in the Constitutional Court, and then we move on to the Supreme Court, and then Labor Court and Administrative Court. There was no room for dual filing, right? All court processes had to go through the system. So whether you like it or not, everybody, including judges, had to use the system, and we amended our laws to that effect. So the option of dual filing was not there. And also, Nyson talked about the issue of training of judges. Yes, we found that to be very important. And we to introduce personalized training for judges. We would assign the technical person to be working with the judge so that they fully understand and embrace the system. And then coming to the second question, I think it was to do with the challenges when we deployed the system from paperful to paperless. Like I said, well, we took the first approach. We started with the superior courts, and then we moved on to the High Court, which is part of the Superior Court. But you find that cases that are heard in our Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court are different from the High Court, because our Supreme Court is the Court of Appeal. So even the external stakeholders who utilize those courts are different. So for the Constitutional Court and the Superior Courts, we didn't face much challenges, because we had stakeholders who already had the required infrastructure and the necessary tools and to utilize the system. But when we then introduced, our third phase was in the General Division of the High Court. There we faced a lot of challenges, because in as much as we had ourselves as JSC, taken the lawyers through trainings, but we could not, in terms of the required infrastructure. Some of them still had to upgrade the internet in the offices. Some still need to purchase the requisite gadgets. So there were challenges, and we had to quickly respond. And one of the interventions we came up with was setting up of internet hubs right at our High Court, so that those who cannot access the system in the offices can get to the internet hubs and do that and access the system. And then finally, when it comes, you talked about the issue of performance indicators. Yes, IECMS says that it generates statistics, right, for the cases for all judges. So the registrars then analyzes the statistics, which cases are pending, which cases stayed so long in one's portal, and then that then feeds into the performance issues for the judges. I think, David?
And I want to ask this question to Khachatur, who can, I guess, answer on behalf of all our panelists. Khachatur, how long did it take to deploy case management systems in the countries of our colleagues in Rwanda and in Zimbabwe? And just like a quick overview of what it took from the synergies perspective to complete that.
Thank you, David. Actually, what we always try to discuss and negotiate, considering the experience that we analyzed in different countries' implementation, is that such kind of project, they shouldn't be the when we say it shouldn't be long, it's the initial piloting. Like for example, in Zimbabwe, we had initiated the piloting with the Constitutional Court and Supreme and Commercial Court in the beginning. Then we added and are still adding new courts, and we're coming, for example, with the magistrate end of the year. If they plan like development itself for 3 years, the failure can be really high. The success is not guaranteed. So it's really important from the initial kickoff of the project to the pilot, it to be less than 1 year or a maximum 1 year. This is what we saw in Zimbabwe after signing the contract when we piloted and had already the first cases coming into the system. And this is what we had also in Rwanda years ago. And so it's important to start, because after it in Rwanda, they start with piloted, for example, in Kigali, in the capital. And then it took time to go into all provinces of the country and to every single institution. The same in Zimbabwe, we piloted in 3 court layers. So it's more about phased approach. Then based on the trainings, infrastructure, and different constraints that were identified, after solving all of them, judiciary started extending. And soon all the registries of all levels of the courts have actually been inside the system. So for the correct timelines and the best that worked based on our experience, because the team who participates, for example, during the assessment or gathering of the requirements, then trainings, if you take 3 years, you increase the risk that those people may leave. So to minimize different risks that come and that your trainings bring the values and people see the change coming. Because nobody wants to hear about the change and then 3 or 5 years later, they will have already forgotten about it. So the time is also of essence in this regard. It also helps the change management committees when they say, we are starting this initiative, and then in less than a year, you say, okay, we have already implemented the initiative and it's going live. So the best timeline is to put all the activities, assessment of requirements, design of the system, implementation, trainings, and go live in 1 year time frame. And then after that 1 year, you can have 3, 4, 5, or even 10 years on doing different phases and improving and extending. But you need to bring the change in a year time, which is always the best that worked. David?
Thank you, Khachatur and Nysen. And thanks to our guest speaker from Zimbabwe, Dr. Katsande. This is all the time that we had for questions today, but we will get back to you individually with answers to your questions via email. And that's why I'm asking you in the chat to leave your email addresses there. And in case you want to discuss this topic in details or you need help with your current activities, we're happy to set up virtual calls and talk about your change management project and plans. I want to thank our participants for their time and attendance. We will publish the recording of the webinar on YouTube and send it to you individually. And if you have any topics that you would like us to speak about in the upcoming webinars, feel free to reply to one of the emails you received from me and suggest the topic. We'll be glad to consider it and acknowledge your name when it's chosen. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and goodbye.